our sponsors for today. I'll read out the sponsorship for the 24th here today. So the morning Bet Midrash program today is sponsored Le'ilu Nishmas Daniel Ben David and Limud Bat Avraham Strauss, Mordechai Ben Moshe and Razel Bat Yosef Meir Marcus, Zichron Livracha. These are the parents of Judy and Menachem Marcus. And my shir is sponsored for the whole academic year. Leilu Nishmas Brana Bas Brandit and Zelig Ben Kalman. Thank you very, very much for those sponsorships. Very much appreciated. And can I remind you, please, to turn off your phones, which is something we always need a little bit of a extra zrizas on. Okay, so given that it's very loud. Okay, I asked them to turn it up a bit because the people at the back said it was not loud enough. So I'll just stand back a little bit. Okay, fine. The topic that we started last week, which I would like to actually continue and conclude next week, please God, is very central. We haven't really spoken about it very much, which is the mitzvah of Emunas Chachamim. When people talk about Emunas Chachamim, we have to have confidence in the rabbinic system. What do they really mean? Where is that coming from? We have to understand a little bit more what that is all about. Last week, in the spirit of Hanukkah, we talked about a very important slice of that, which was the second Bet HaMikdash and the Hanukkah period and the time of the Sanhedrin, and the fact that much of our rabbinic halachic structure and process comes from that time. A great deal comes from that time. What I want to do today is move it forward to discussion about the Talmud. And we've got a lot to do today. I'm going to try and actually squeeze a shir and a half into one shir so that we don't go for much longer than next week. But next week, I want to talk about something which I think is very rarely talked about, is what is the Shulchan Aruch? Why is it so central? How did it come about? Do we really follow it? Do we not follow it? And actually that share will reveal a lot of interesting, undercurrents of the halachic process that we have today in the 21st century. And therefore it carries on from this share. There's a little bit of history involved. I actually like history a lot. I'm an amateur historian, obviously nothing like on the same level as Rabbi Wein, Zichron Livracha, and certainly not an academic historian, but nevertheless we need to bring a little history in. So before we get into the sources on this week's sheet, let me give you a little bit of background. How do we get from last week's shir into this week's shir? So last week's shir we talked about the Sanhedrin and the central authority of the Sanhedrin. Based on the psukim of Lo Sasur, the Torah says, do not deviate from the words of the Sanhedrin, follow their commands. And that's why, as we said last week, you can say, Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. God commanded us to light Shabbos candles, to light Hanukkah candles, to do all the rabbinic mitzvahs that we do, because that is a delegated legislation from the Sanhedrin. Now, it may not have escaped your notice that we don't have a Sanhedrin anymore. What happened to the Sanhedrin? So, in very brief terms, already by the middle of the Second Temple period, the Sanhedrin was losing its hold on the people. And that became very much part of what we call the Sinat Chinam kind of process. And there was schism and factionalism within the Jewish people. There was even a civil war. If you remember, the great-grandchildren of the Hashmonaim, the original Hashmonaim, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, are actually killing each other with Jews, killing Jews in the land of Israel towards the end of the Second Temple period. And this caused a breach, a pirud of the halachic system where the Gemara says it was like the Torah was turning into two Torahs, a schism. In fact, the Mishnah says already from the time of Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi Ish Yerushalayim, who were the first of the Zugot they received from Antigonus of Socho, already from that period of time, the Torah didn't work like it had up until then. They'd lost what they called the Eshkolot. Who are the Eshkolot? I once saw a sign for a very prominent thinker, Talmud Chacham, and it said on the shul he'd passed away, and he said we've now lost one of the Eshkolot. And somebody came up to me and said, well, was this guy a grapefruit seller? What's going on with this guy? But that's Eshkoliot. Okay, and Eshkolot, the Mishnah says the Eshkolot. So the Gemara says Ish HaKolbo, somebody who can encompass everything, like a Renaissance man, we might say in this sense. But that came to an end, and Rashi explains from that point onwards there was built-in machlokas. People were not accepting the psak of the Sanhedrin. There was what Rashi says was doifi Dupi, remember from the Hashamnas, Dibarnu Dofi. Dofi means two views, two opinions. Machlokas and Shichacha. Things were getting confused and lost. To the point, and I haven't seen this explicitly, but I think this is the case, the next generation after those two was Yeshua ben Parachia, and he was the one that said, Asei lecha Rav. You better get yourself a rabbi. Why didn't anyone say that before? Because you had a rabbi. It's called the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is everybody's rabbi. But once the Sanhedrin is no longer unified, then you have to asay lecha Rav. You get different shitot. I'm from Beis Hillel. I'm from Beis Shammai. I'm from Rabbi Akiva school. I'm from Rabbi Yishmael school. And you end up with this divergent system. Now, already by the time of Hillel and Shammai, they realized that this was not going in a good direction. Once the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, it was going in an even worse direction. And they realized they needed to create a replacement for the Sanhedrin. What is the replacement for the Sanhedrin? It's called the Talmud. That's what the Talmud is. What we call the Mishnah and the Gemara, let's call that together the Talmud, is meant to be the replacement. They knew they wouldn't get a Sanhedrin anytime soon, certainly one that worked properly. Therefore, they began that process already from the just before the Churban, Hillel and Shammai, of codifying, of putting the oral law into text. Maybe it was an oral text at the beginning. The Mishnah may not have been written down at the very beginning, but they started to produce what you and I now call and know as Mishnayot, little nuggets of codified, concentrated law, which put across the basic principles of Jewish law, around which there was still a lot of oral law. 4,192 Mishnayot. And there are people who memorize pretty much the whole lot, meant to be very memorizable. And they were the Mishnah, and eventually the Gemara was the growing commentary around the Mishnah. We'll see in today's sheet exactly how that's meant to work. And at a certain point, the Talmud was finished. And the finished Talmud is what we now have as the Sanhedrin, until we get a new one. That's why the Talmud looks like it looks. Rabbis across generations arguing with each other. Sometimes people that didn't even meet each other meet in the Talmud. Why? Because it's meant to replicate the Sanhedrin, where later views can overturn earlier views, and they can argue with each other and produce out of that conversation a unified psak. That's why the Talmud looks like the Talmud looks. And it's a brilliant book. It's a synthesized book. We'll see what that means in a minute. And it's meant to be that multi-generational conversation of all the rabbis who used to be able to talk in the Sanhedrin and now talk in the Talmud. That's what the Talmud was and is. Why do we never get another one? We'll come to that. Why do we never need one before? Because we had a Sanhedrin. And the actual physical Sanhedrin itself was eventually abolished by the Byzantines, even though it had ceased to have any real effects long before that. If you open up the Mishnah, you see Rabbi Akiva says this and Rabbi Eliezer says this. Well, why didn't they just ask the Sanhedrin? And there just need to be two opinions. The answer is, didn't work. Wasn't functioning. Okay, fine. Now, what I want to talk about today is what is the line that closes the Talmud? And for us, that's so important, because what differentiates an orthodox psak, a psak which is based in an authentic halachic discussion, is the assumption that we cannot argue with the Talmud anymore. The Rambam says, just like the Sanhedrin had the mitzvah of lois sasor, so too whatever the Talmud concludes, that is subject to lois sasor. We may not disagree with it, because it's part of the fixed halachic system. And the question is, why? Who decided that? Why can't I just disagree with the Talmud? If you open up Lahavdil, a conservative rabbinic tshuva, they don't tend to write as many of these as they used to do, but back in the old days when they were closer, if you like, to the more orthodox classic halachic system, they would analyze the Gemara. And at the end of the analysis, they would say, well, the conclusion of the Gemara is X, but we, the Rabbinic Assembly, have decided we don't like that, or we don't want that, and we voted by, 15 to 19 that we're going to override the Talmud and we're going to do something different. That is the difference between, classically, an orthodox psak and a conservative psak. Conservative psak says the Talmud's very interesting, but it's not binding, and we'll do whatever we like, and if we don't like it, we'll change. Of course, the Reform don't have a psak because they are not interested in a halachic system. In a sense, it's more consistent within itself. They say, okay, fine. The Gemara is very interesting as a historical, cultural document, but it has no basis in any kind of legal sense. Okay, good. So that's the Reform. Conservatism says it's interesting and it's influential, but it's not binding. And the Orthodox world says, yes, it is binding. And we'll see in a minute where that comes from. Of course, it's not always easy to know what the Gemara actually says. But it's not meant to be easy because it's meant to yield different results to different analysis because it's meant to be a flexible Sanhedrin. That's the point. It's not a bug. It's what's the word? A feature. That's right. It's a feature of the Gemara that it's not clear. It's not a bug. It's a feature because it's meant to allow for those different answers being pulled out. Now, with that Hakdama, which should have been really a share in and of itself, let's look at this issue. So on the first page, I've given you a little bit of background historically of where we all were between the years 500 and 800. That's not an area of history that's so much studied. It's what in secular terms is called the Dark Ages. But for us, we never had a Dark Ages. Too loud? Yes, my fault. I told them to turn it up. Okay. We never had a dark... I'll just talk quieter. It's fine. I'll save my voice. We never had a Dark Ages. We had a period of the sealing of the Gemara and the Gaonim, which we'll come on to in a minute. So if you look here in Bavel, we were under the Persians and they were conquered by the Arabs in 637. In Eretz Yisrael, we were under very crushing persecution under the Byzantines, and they were conquered by the Arabs in 644. And everywhere else in Spain, they were originally pagan, and then they became Christian, and they got particularly anti-Jewish. People might not realize that the Jews were expelled from Spain in the secular year 613. Easy year to remember, right? Meaning, I'm not talking about 1492. 1492 was 1,000 years later, 900 years later. But in the year 613, we were conquered by the newly Catholic Spanish, but then the Arabs conquered there too. France and Germany, the Goths and the Franks became Catholic, and they threw us out also in 629. But the Arabs never conquered France. The Arabs have made 2 attempts, which were unsuccessful, to conquer Europe. Which one was the Battle of Tours, which was the Arabs were defeated by Charles Martel and stopped them from coming from Spain all the way into France and taking over Europe. Later on in the Battle of Vienna, the Ottomans were stopped from taking over Europe from the other side, although they took Eastern Europe, the Arabs were in charge of Hungary, etc. Those 2 attempts by the Arab world to conquer Europe failed, but the last 25 years that has succeeded. And now, without having to actually fight against anybody, the entire Arab world has basically taken over Europe. And according to almost everybody I've heard over the last year or 2, it's a done deal. There's nothing to be done. And now Europe is basically going to be an Islamic state going forward 30, 40 years. So what they couldn't do in the 7th century and the 15th century, they succeeded to do in the 21st century. So, but for us, that was very important because Islam enabled the Jews to then spread out across what became known as the Sephardic world. Meaning if the Jews were in Babylonia, for hundreds and hundreds, over 1,000 years from the first exile of Nebuchadnezzar all the way through to the 5th, 6th, 7th century, they weren't able to spread out because you had the Babylonian empires, the Sasanian Empire, and you had the Roman Empire. When those 2 things both broke down, that enabled the Jews from Babel to start spilling out all through North Africa and eventually to Spain, and they became known as the Sephardi community and developed their own Sephardic minhagim. No one quite knows where the Ashkenazim came from. It's a bit of a mystery. By the 9th, 10th century, they popped up in northern Germany and France, a very small community, very, very small community. We're talking millions of Sephardim and a few tens of thousands of Ashkenazim. The best theory that we have is that they came through Italy from Eretz Yisrael, and they came through Italy across the Alps up into northern France and Germany sometime in the 8th, 9th century, and they became the Ashkenazim, but they weren't really a force to be reckoned with until the Rashi and the Balei Tosfos, which we're going to get to more next time. But you had the Sephardic community, you had the Ashkenazic community, and you had a few others as well. So let's get into the sources. You can read more about the actual history on your own time. Number 1, this is perhaps the most important source. The Gemara says about itself, and we've never really looked at this before, Rebbe v'Rebbe Nosson Soif Mishnah. The end of the Mishnah was Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, and Rebbe Nosson, partners that edited and finalized the Mishnah. We're talking around the year 200, just before. Rav Ashi and Ravina, 2 Babylonian rabbis in the 6th, 5th, end of the 5th century, Sof Hora'ah. They are the end of Hora'ah. Now, it doesn't say Sof Gemara. The first bit says Sof Mishnah. The second says Sof Hora'ah. What's Hora'ah? Psak. Ruling, teaching. They were the end of ruling. We'll see what that means in a few minutes. But somehow a line was drawn by Rav Ashi and Ravina that became the Talmud. We'll see it's not as straightforward as that. If you look here at Rav Shmuel HaNagid, who was writing in Spain later on. Actually, the introduction to the Talmud of Rav Shmuel HaNagid was probably not written by Rav Shmuel HaNagid. That's a whole academic discussion. But it was written around the same time. We're talking around the 11th century. So he says a similar thing. Trei shechibru ha-Talmud, the two rabbis who really put together the Talmud, Haim Rav Ashi v'Ravina, v'siatam, Rav Ashi Ravina and their editorial team. It was not just these two men. Ubiyameham, and in those days, nechtam ha-Talmud. That's when the Talmud was sealed. Chatima was sealed. Now, if you open up most from history books, that's what you'll read. In the time of Rav Ashi and Ravina, the Talmud was sealed. The actual answer might be a little bit more complicated, which we'll get to as we go through today. But what did that statement mean? So let's have a look at this very important Rashi, how Rashi understood this in number 3. So Rashi says, Sof Mishnah. What does it mean that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rav Nosson, and Rabbi Nosson, were the end of the Mishnah? So he says, number 3, Sof Tanaim, the end of the Tanaim. The Tanaim are the rabbis of the Mishnaic period, who we know and love, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Ishmael, and Beit Hillel, and Beit Shammai, and all those people that make it into the Mishnah. Ad Yemehem, until that final editing process, again, we're talking about the end of the 2nd century, Ad Yemehem, CE, Amru ish et dvarav bebeis hamedrash. Every Rav was able to give his opinion in the Bet Midrash. Again, you might say, where's the Sanhedrin? The answer is not working. It's there, it's not working. V'hayu talmidim gorsim shmua levada. And the talmidim of whichever the Rav was, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer, would write down those teachings separately. V'lo hayu masechdot. There were no fixed volumes of Masechdot, Sidurot in any kind of order, Veseder, the Kavetz ala Seder. There's nothing together organized in a way that the Mishnah later became. V'hein, but this editorial team, Rebbe and Reb Nosson, Kalalu ha'amu b'dorish lifneihem. They gathered together everything that had been said in previous generations. V'sidru, and they made order. Et Masechtot. They made the Masechtot that we know and love. You open up a Mishnah, what became known as Shas, Shisha, Sidrei, Mishnah. It's nothing to do with the political party, although it's a brilliant piece of branding. If you're going to call your political party Shas, which of course means Shomrei Sfarad, the guardians of the Sephardic tradition, you call it Shas. People, Shas, we love Shas, we know Shas. It's brilliant marketing if you think of a name, okay? They thought, I don't know how much they paid their marketing people to come up with that name originally, but it's fantastic. It does the trick. So they finished this Masechtot. V'achreihem, and underlined here, you see, after them, lo yosifu elo ma'at. They only added a very small amount after the Mishnah. Now you might turn around and say, well, how can that be? The Mishnah, if it's all together in one book, is about this thin. The Talmud is, the Art Scroll Talmud is about 85, 90 volumes. A standard Talmud is 6 or 7 or 10, 15 volumes. What do you mean they didn't add much? They made it 25 times bigger. The answer is, they didn't add much in terms of legal principle, meaning the job of the Gemara is not to make new rabbinic laws, it's to analyze what the Mishnah says. And like we said last week, much of what the Mishnah says was from the time of the Sanhedrin. It's not debated, it's not disputed, it's not separate opinions. Much is, but much isn't. And therefore the Gemara doesn't really add that much in terms of new ideas. Very important Rashi. So good, so that's the Mishnah. We know the Mishnah, we love the Mishnah. Everybody here should take an opportunity to learn Mishnah. Mishnah also took on a very mystical and Kabbalistic role. We'll see next week with Rav Yosef Karo. Rav Yosef Karo had a Maggid. We'll talk about his Maggid next week. The Maggid of a voice that spoke through his mouth, which was a visitation of the spirit of the Mishnah. Why he was so in love with the Mishnah, that we'll talk about next week, but that's a whole love affair, which I'm not getting into now. But let's get into the Gemara. Sof Hora'ah, third line of number 3. What does it mean, the end of ruling? Rav Ashi and Ravina, end of the 5th century. Sof Kol HaAmoraim. This was the end of the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara period. The Adi Mayhem Loi Haita Gemara. Until then, there was nothing called Gemara. Gemara means teaching or finishing. Al has said that there was nothing organized. When a question was raised, Nishelet, which was raised, Batam HaMishnah. What does the Mishnah mean? A question was raised, Beit HaMidrash, in the Beit Midrash, or Sheila Amase Amorea, or a question about a shaila of something that happened that needed to be answered. Bedin Mammon, maybe in monetary law, or Issa V'Heta, or ritual law. What happened after the Mishnah? Kol echad ve'echad oimetama. Every rabbi later said, I think the Mishnah means this. I think the answer is this. I think that the responsum should be this. V'Rav Ashi v'Ravinu sidru shmuas amorayim shelifnehem. Rav Ashi and Ravina gathered all of those pieces of analysis from all of the Batei Midrash, which were mostly in Bavel, but also in Eretz Yisrael. There was a Talmud Yerushalmi that was an unfinished attempt to do this, which they clearly had. They gathered them all together. Okay, 1 second. V'kavu al seidah ha'masechtas kol echad v'echad el ha'mishnah haru etzel ha'mishnah haru'iyu v'hashnui aleh. And this is the genius. Rav Ashi and Ravina and their editorial team are sitting there in Babylon, in Pumbedisa, in Surah, and they have before them, I don't know if it's written things, but they have mountains of texts, and they have a Mishnah, and they say, okay, we've got to decide which pieces of this analysis go with which Mishnayos. And we're going to decide. And sometimes it's obvious because it's a direct commentary on that Mishnah. And sometimes it's not obvious. It's a piece of financial advice, marital advice, medical advice. And they have to decide, okay, where's the most sensible place to put this in an order which makes sense to people? And they did that massive, massive editing job. The Hikshu Kushas, and they, the editorial team, started asking questions that they put in the text. Sheyesh lehashiv, which they needed to answer. Upirukim, and responses sheruim letaretz. Haim v'ha'amorayim shemahem. Them and their team that were with them, v'kavu hakol b'Gemara. And they put that into the Gemara. We'll talk about this in a minute. Kagain, Eisvei. Anyone who learns Gemara, a question was asked, or a challenge was asked. Meisvei, Raminhu, Iboilahu, all the voice of the Gemara. Now, when you're learning Gemara, there's a voice, there's an editor's voice that's leading you through the Gemara. It's saying, this is a problem, this is a question, here's the answer. Who is that? Who's that voice? It's not one of the opinions. It seems to be the editor, the narrator is taking you through and asking you and leading you on this journey. Says Rashi, that's the editorial team. They put those questions in. And they put all the answers in. But based on what they had in front of them. Okay, those people who'd asked questions, they hadn't been organized in the Masechtas this way. Mishnah, Shesida Rabbi, Rav Ashi v'Ravinu, and Ravina and Rav Ashi decided on putting them in. And anyone who's ever learnt any Talmud will know that it goes off on tangents, but there's usually a systematic kind of thread of sort of stream of consciousness as you go through the Talmud. That was put there on purpose. So the Talmud is not a book that fell into our laps from heaven. It's a book that was put together very systematically in a very manufactured, if you like, way by Rav Ashi, Ravina, and his team, and we'll see later people as well, and they put together that material. And they included everything before. Now, how do we know that that's binding? So I've brought you a whole bunch of different sources, Sfaradim, Ashkenazim. It is axiomatic that whatever the conclusion of the Gemara is, and that could be debated, and is debated, it's binding. Let me just give you 3 or 4 different examples. The Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, here number 4. The ilav the pasik b'Gemara. If it's not paskin in the Gemara, halacha kamoisa, that halacha follows this opinion, loy samchin and apsak de masnisim. We never rely on the Mishnayos. That's a very important point. Mishnah is not halacha lemaisa. Mishnah is a collection of different opinions of the Tanaim, but it is not a psak. Even on those few occasions where the Mishnah says, drum roll, and the halacha is X, we don't usually follow it. The Gemara decides what the halacha is, says the Rashba. But the statements that are ruled by the Amorayim, vaday samchinon. That's what we certainly rely on. The Kevan shepaskum v'kasvum Rav Ashi v'Ravina. Here's those 2 names again. Since Rav Ashi and Ravina ordered them, put them together, shehem sof hara, they're the end of ruling. Vaday alehim samchinan. That's what we definitely rely on. The hakaim alam b'Bava Metzia, because we have in Bava Metzia Rav Ashi v'Ravina sof hara. Ha'ein adam rashai lechadish davar me'atzah. You're not able to come up with anything new now. You can tell me what you think the Gemara says, but you can't argue with the Gemara. Elavadai kemoshe pasku achronim kach naaseh. Achronim, he's talking about the rabbis of the Gemara. Whatever they said, that's what we do. The Rashba, the Rimigash from the school of the Rif, the Sfaradim, number 5. V'zeh ha-Talmud shelanu, this Talmud of ours, halacha lemaisa hu. It is the binding halacha. Shalom nichtav ela la'acha iyon, because it was only written after a lot of analysis, v'dikduk, very carefully, bakama doiros, over many generations. That's interesting, because up until now we've really only had Ravina and Ravashi. He said, no, this was a multi-generational task before them, maybe even after them. Just one second. And it went through a number of editions. The Rav Ashi put together multiple editions during their lifetime of the Gemara until the final edit was made. And it's telling us basically whatever we have to do, that's what they said. Yes, sir.
First of all, the Gemara rarely, after all the discussion, really tells us what happened.
Rarely. And when it does, by the way, say v'hilchasa, and the halacha is, almost always that's put in later by the Gaonim. And it's not the original text. Because that's the point. The Gemara doesn't want to come to clear conclusions. It wants to present you with the arguments and the analysis, and you're meant to work out the conclusions.
That's why Rambam had to write it.
We'll get there. Well, I guess that's next week's share. Okay, that's next week's share. What do we do with all of this analysis? So that was the Rimigash. We don't argue with the Talmud. The Rambam, number 6. Ka'asha meisu kol hachachamim aleim hashalom, when all those chachamim died, she'achroni mehem Ravina v'Ravashi, of which the final ones are Ravina and Ravashi. V'kvar neshlam ha-Talmud, and the Talmud was finished. Harikol misha amad achrav, everyone who comes after the Talmud, ein matarasoi el havonas divreihem shechibru bilvad. All we're trying to do after the Talmud is work out, what does the Talmud mean? What does it say? What's its conclusion? Alav ein lahoisif, umimenu ein ligra. You may not add to the Talmud, you may not take away from the Talmud. You see, those words are what we usually say about the Torah, about the mitzvahs. You may not add to mitzvahs, you may not take away from mitzvahs, says the Rambam. That's the Talmud now. It's fixed. It's oral law. Yes, sir.
And yet still there's the Rambam, the Torah, and the Rif, and the Ran, etc., who might not agree what the actual.
Of course, the Rambam completely accepts that you might not agree with the next Talmud Chacham on what the Gemara means, but whatever the Gemara means, based on your analysis, that's what you have to do. Okay? But of course, built in is the idea that it means multiple things. That's the whole idea of replacing the Sanhedrin. And the Ramah says the same thing, the Vilna Gaon, look in number 7. Of course, the corollary, which we'll see, is that later than the Gemara, you can argue with. Number 7. Says the Ramah, Rav Moshe Islis in Krakow, more of him next week. Mihu yesh aimrim. I want to suggest to you, if a particular posek thinks or feels, this is in Choshen Mishpat, so we're talking about Dayanim. Ulivnei Dairo, and people in his generation feel and think, Mikoach Rayas Muchrachos, and they feel they can prove it from the analysis, She'ein Hadin Kamoshe Huskeba Poiskim, that the din is not like the previous generations, meaning the Ramah, who's in the 1500s. So if you come along and analyze the halacha, and you disagree with the rabbis of the 1400s, the 1300s, and the 1200s, and the 1100s, then it's an open field. You can argue with anyone you like. As long as it's not something which is clearly in the Gemara, says the Vilna Gaon. Because the Gemara we won't argue, we won't add, and we won't take away. And we certainly won't argue because Ravina and Rav Ashi is so far wrong. So comes along the Ramah, and again we'll look at this next week in more detail, and says, well, actually it's a double-edged sword. You can't argue with the Gemara, but you can argue with everybody else, everyone after the Gemara. Meaning he doesn't seem to feel that there's a kind of like an impermeable membrane between any other posek later and any other. The Gemara is the only line you can't cross, but anyone else's analysis, just because I'm later, doesn't mean I can't argue with somebody earlier. And this came up last week. Well, do we find that the later Rabbanim do not argue with the earlier Rabbanim? Says the Ramah. No, lav dafka, not necessarily. The only line we can't cross is the Gemara. And we'll see this becomes a difference of approach next week in the Sephardi halacha and the Ashkenazi halacha. The Sephardim are much more likely to draw later lines that they feel they can't cross. The Ashkenazim are reluctant to do that. They end up a little bit doing that in the 20th century, but they're reluctant to do that. And the Ramah is saying that very, very clearly. In fact, we see very much from the Gemara itself, and the Yamshel Shlomo, who is the Rav Shlomo Luria, a cousin of the Ramah, actually brings this down here in his commentary. We'll see much more from him next week. Number 8. Normally, we don't paskin like a Talmud over their own Rav. Yeah, the earlier ones take priority. And even though that's the case until Abaya and Rava, from Abaya and Rava onwards, that's a very important phrase. The halacha follows the later people. Why might we prefer later Rabbonim over earlier Rabbonim? Because the later Rabbonim have an advantage. They've seen everything that the earlier Rabbonim have. And the earlier Rabbonim have not seen the later ones, by definition. So says the Marashal, the Yamshel Shlomo, actually we favor, a little bit like the Ramah said, we favor the later authorities. Because the later authorities have more perspective. They have more understanding. Are they necessarily bigger? Not necessarily. We'll come to Eurydice Adoris in a minute, but you've got this kind of dwarves on the shoulders of giants image that is brought down a lot. Even if the later generations are smaller in their own abilities, they stand on the shoulders of the earlier generations, and therefore they have a wider panorama, which is a very important idea. And therefore, we see that very clearly, which leads to a question, which is, if anyone's opened a page of Gemara, one of the most fundamental realities is the Amoraim don't argue with the Tanaim. Yeah? If you the way you defeat an argument by an Amora in the Gemara is to say, look, there's a Brisa against you. It can't be right. So he can bring another Brisa that says, well, this Brisa agrees with me, or this, but you can't argue with the Tana. It's like the knockout blow. The Tanaim are against you. Okay, I give up. Why? Why do they give up? Let's turn around and say, well, we're later, we have a broader panorama. Why can't we disagree with the earlier authorities? That's a very important question, and that's actually raised by the Rambam's commentary here. Look at number 9, the Kesef Mishnah. Who is the Kesef Mishnah? Also Rav Yosef Karo. We'll see him much more next week with the Shulchan Aruch. Says as follows. He's commenting on the Rambam. The Kesef Mishnah is the Rav Yosef Karo's commentary on the Rambam. And he says as follows. On the Rambam's comment that a later authority, a later Sanhedrin, could always overrule an earlier one, because we need them to have that flexibility. He says as follows. Lamad mikan Rabbeinu. The Rambam learns from here, number 9. Mimai da ashkechan Tanai batrai, de pligi yakamai. We see that later Tanaim disagree with earlier Tanaim. Yeah? You never see Rabbi Akiva come along and say, oh, Beit Hillel are before me, or Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is before me. I can't disagree with him. You don't see that. Anyone can disagree with anyone within the strata of the Mishnah. So too, he says, V'amorai, v'kein amoraim basrai pligi akamai. And so too, later Amoraim argue quite happily with earlier Amoraim. Rav Ashi, who is very late, will happily take on Rava and Abaya, who are much earlier. Why? Why do they do that? The im Toma, and if you say, Im Kena my Lord Pligi Amoraya Tanai. So why does it stop after the Mishnah? Why don't the Amoraim later argue with the Tanaim? Because we see on every page of the Shas, every page of Gemara, you ask on the Amoraim, they must need from a Brisa, or from a Mishnah, from a Brisa. Why don't the later Amoraim turn around and say, well, I don't agree with this Mishnah. I think differently. They can't say that. Why not? Why have you drawn the line? And this is so critical. Ukefi divrei Rabbeinu. The answer, according to the Rambam, is harashus netuna lehem lachloik al divrei hatanaim. It should be that the later authorities have free reign to disagree with anyone before them. So why can't they? The F Shaloma, I want to suggest, he says as follows: Shemiyom chasimas mishnah kimu v'kiblu. From the Mishnah onwards, the people accepted Shadairas Achronim lo yachloku al harishonim. It was a national acceptance that we agree that we're not going to disagree with that earlier strata. V'chein asu gam b'chasimas haGemara, and this is the same thing that happened when the Gemara was sealed. Shemiyom shenechtama, from the time that it was sealed, lo nitan rishut l'shum adam lachlok aleh. So why is the Mishnah binding on the Gemara? And why is the Gemara binding on us? for the same reason that the Sanhedrin was binding, because we accepted the authority of the Sanhedrin. Remember we said at the end of last week, if the people turned around to the Sanhedrin and said, no, that's just a gezerah too far, that's too onerous, we can't cope with that, it has no standing. Why can't the courts just say, hey, we're the rabbis, you're the people, we tell you what to do, you don't tell us what to do? No, it doesn't work that way. The people have to be behind the halakhic process. So says the Kesef Mishnah, just like the people underpinned the authority of the Sanhedrin, so too the people decided. The people, who are the people? The educated rabbis and the people of Bavel who came after the Mishnah, we're not going to argue with the Mishnah. And so too, the people decided, we're not going to argue with the Gemara. Now again, who are in the people and who are out of the people? What about the Karaites? The Karaites came later and they say, well, we're not part of those people. We're different people. We don't want to accept the authority of the Gemara. We want to make our own Gemara. So why are the Karaites wrong and we're right? Because OUisrael as a whole decided. And where are the Karaites now? There's no Karaites now. I mean, there are a few. But there are a few here, a few there in Tel Aviv and in Russia and whatever. But the Karaites just ended up not part of the halachic process. So there is a kind of hashgacha as to how this works. The people decide, like the Gemara says, Im lav neviim heim, if the community aren't prophets, b'nei neviim heim, then they're trainee prophets. We take the mass intuition of the Jewish people very, very seriously. And that's why the people accepted the Mishnah and the people accepted the Gemara. Yes, sir?
If I understand correctly, there was no such red line between the Sanhedrin and the Tanaim.
Correct.
It was absolutely accepted, and it wasn't only that the public, by poll or survey, it was simply known that you could not be cholek on Sanhedrin. Is that correct?
Correct, because the Gemara, the next source, number 10, which we're not going to do again because we did last week, says you're not allowed to be cholek on the Sanhedrin. But that only works when people accept it. Meaning the Zakein Mamre, the one person that says, or two or whatever, I don't accept the psak of the Sanhedrin, he has to be put to death. But what happens when the whole system breaks down? We had a total system breakdown in the end of the Second Temple. So all the Sanhedrin are going to put everyone to death? They stopped putting anyone to death. Why? Because the whole thing was out of control. And that's why they realized they needed to make a new system. That new system is called the Mishnah and the Talmud, because the Sanhedrin had ceased to be a system because the people were all fighting and killing each other. You can't have a transmission of Torah when all the Jews are killing all the Jews. So they needed to have a new system. What we have today is beautiful by comparison. Baruch Hashem. We have people who really disagree with each other and even delegitimize each other, which is not good. But it's not like we don't have the same kind of breakdown as the Second Temple period. The Netziv, by the way, warned. The Netziv warned in the late 1800s, even if you get all the Jewish people back to Eretz Israel and everybody goes back, you can't guarantee that it's not going to just spiral back out of control again like it did at the end of the Second Temple period. So we've got to keep our eye on the ball. And at the moment, I think, Baruch Hashem, we're doing pretty well as a Jewish people. Okay, we sometimes get a bit of help from the outside when the non-Jews turn on us and hate all of us, and that makes us all feel more connected. And okay, I wish it didn't have to be that way, but that helps as well. The old saying, if the Jews don't make Kiddush, the non-Jews make Havdalah. So one way or other, we'll be separated from the other people. Okay, fine. So what was this acceptance? We see this Kesef Mishnah. The people agreed we're not going to argue with the Gemara. So I want to bring you three different approaches, which I think are absolutely fascinating, about why this actually took place. Have a look here on page number 3. So Rav Shri wrote a very important letter. He was one of the Gaonim living in the 10th century. He was the father of Rav Hai Gaon, and he wrote an Igeret. He wrote a letter about the development of the halachic process. And in this letter of Rav Shri, it's available in English translation. It's very worthwhile reading. He says, here's the story so far, the story until the 10th century. And he explains very straightforward that there was a decline of the generations. They just passed a place that they just didn't feel they could go back. Number 11, because Rabbi, who put the Mishnah together, saw such diversity in the teachings of our sages, even though they all shared the same underlying principles. He feared that these teachings would not endure and proliferate, and loss would ensue. He saw that the heart was diminishing, the well springs of wisdom were being blocked up, and the Torah was disappearing. As Rabbi Yochanan says in Eruvin, the hearts of the early ones are like the entrance to the Ulam, but the hearts of the later ones are like the entrance to the Heichel. Who were the early ones? Rabbi Akiva. Who were the later ones? Rabbi Eliezer ben Shammua. Yeridas Hadoros. Generations are going down. So too, he says, number 12. When the Mishnah was concluded and Rabbi died, the capacity for learning lessened, and they had to collate their Talmuds to recite it in a uniform version. They also included in their Talmud things which would have been unnecessary for the earlier sages. Those earlier sages whose capacity for learning was great had not needed to have all these concepts explained. But after the earlier sages, wisdom decreased, as we learned at the end of Sota. Since Rabbi Akiva died, the wellsprings of Torah have been blocked. And the same situation existed in the time of Rabbi. We passed a point that we just couldn't argue anymore. We're just too small. Number 13, along came the next generation and the heart was diminished. Certain matters that had been clear to the early sages were not clear to us, etc. Now in this generation, these matters became subject to doubt, and they had to establish them in the Gemara with an exact wording. In each succeeding generation, the heart became diminished. As Rabbi Yochanan says in Eruvin, he uses all these metaphors. Our generation is like the eye of a fine needle, meaning nothing goes through it. Yeah, you teach them and nothing goes in. It's like trying to thread a needle in the dark. Also, Abaye said, we're like a peg in the wall with regards to Gemara. You try and stick a soft peg in a hard wall. It just falls down. It's just not going in. Rava said, we're like a finger in wax as regards logic. How hard is our logic? How firm are our foundations? Well, take your finger and push it in a piece of wax. That's as good as our logic is. We can't do it. Rav Ashi said we're like a finger in a pit as regards forgetfulness, like a big hole. Meaning the later generations really felt that they were less able than the earlier. Now, we somehow have to work this in to what we said before, but the later generations are higher. They see more. We follow the later generations because they have the... So how are we going to square these two things? So what we're going to end up saying, according to Rosh Hashanah, is yes, within a strata, the later people have authority to disagree with the early ones. Later Tanaim over earlier Tanaim, later Amoraim over earlier Amoraim, later Rabbonim later over earlier. But there's certain things happen in the Jewish world which are just sort of cataclysmic, catastrophic. And then afterwards, everybody turns around and says, okay, things are just never going to be the same again. And this is where history kicks into this process. For example, the Spanish expulsion. There was almost an overnight reality that the world will just never be the same again. The Black Death, we're going to see next week. The Black Death was a very important watershed. After the Black Death, the communities were decimated. 25% of all Jews in Europe died. 25%. Now, even more non-Jews died because maybe different, standards of hygiene, maybe not. But then, of course, the Jews were blamed for everybody dying, so Jews were killed because the less of them died. But one way or the other, can you imagine if, God forbid, 1 in 4 people that you ever knew just ceased to be there within a space of 3 years? It's cataclysmic. So the later generations turn around and said, okay, you're right, that we stand on the shoulders of giants, but this is different. This is just different now. Where are you going to draw those lines? What are those events that is the Holocaust one of those events? They're like, oh, everything's different now. Is the founding of the state of Israel one of those events? That whatever went before, it's different now. How are you going to read that? In retrospect, you see that. You don't always see that on the morning. Very few people woke up one morning and said, okay, yesterday we were Tanaim, but today we're all Amoraim. It's not like that. We were Rishonim and we're now... when you look back through Jewish history, you see how somehow the hashgacha, that God's hand in history, these things will never be the same again. Again, I don't know if that affects halacha in any way, but I think everybody feels that after October 7th. Whatever happened before, we don't know which direction things are going in, and maybe they'll go in a direction which is great, but it's never going to be the same again. So how are you going to read this into the halakhic process? That's very exciting. Yes?
You see the historical decline turning around now, there's 60,000 people sitting in line.
Good, I guess, yes. It could be. Meaning things go down, but that doesn't necessarily mean the later people are not able to do more than the earlier until you reach one of these watersheds, and then, okay, so now it's different.
You can never return it back.
Well, we will get a Sanhedrin back, but that's like a whole new thing. Yes?
But after the Black Death, Judaism went up in Eastern Poland.
Yes.
Poles,
Yes. Yes, but that the explosion of population amongst the Ashkenazim really happened quite a long time later. It really happened in the 17 and 1800s, that you had a relatively small Ashkenazi population that suddenly became like jumbo population. And now you think, well, who's bigger, Ashkenazim or Sfaradim? So people usually think, oh, Ashkenazim are bigger, right? in the 11th century was completely the opposite, which is why we have all these Ashkenazi genetic problems, because all Ashkenazi Jews, they think, are descended from the same 400 or 500 fertile women that lived sometime in the mid-1300s, and we kind of bottlenecked into that. I need to go on a little bit. So that's the decline of the generation. Says the Rambam, I have a different answer. A brilliant answer, a fascinating answer. And I'm going to read it all inside, but I'm going to leave you to read some of it on your own. Maybe just read a little bit here. Go to page number 4. Says the Rambam, I have a different answer. It's not the decline of the generations. Nimtze Ravina v'Rav Ashi v'chavereihem sof gedoli chachmei Yisrael hamatikim Torah shebal peh. Ravina Rav Ashi represented the end of an era of transmission of Torah shebal peh. Why? Shigazru gezeres ve'kinu takanos ve'inhigu min hagos, and whatever they decreed, whatever they introduced, upashta gezerasam v'takanasam ve'minhagos minhagosam b'chol Yisrael. That spread. That caught on. The people accepted it. B'chol makom hashmo shveihim, wherever they lived, because the Jews were focused in Bavel. What those Jews said was accepted by the broader Jewish community. If you look at a snapshot of the Jews in the year 500, 400, they're in Bavel. Oh, there's a few Jews scattered in Spain and a tiny community in France and a small community in Italy, but everybody's in Bavel. Therefore, he says as follows, V'acha based in Rav Ashi shechiba ha-Gemara. And after Rav Ashi, who wrote the Gemara, V'gamru b'mei benoi, and it was finished in the time of his children, of his son, Nitpazru Yisrael b'chol ha'aretz ad pizur yeter. The Jewish people were just scattered all around the globe. V'higiu lekatsois v'yim rechokim. They came to the very edges of the world. What's the edge of the world? The end of the world. Angleterra. England. England's the end of the world. There's nothing else. After England, you fall off the edge of the sea, right? You fall into nothing. Okay? No one knew about America in those days. Okay? So they went to the farthest islands. V'ravta katata ba'olam, and the whole world just became so much more of a war scenario. They were conquering Arabs and conquering Goths and Visigoths and Vandals, and everyone's going nuts, basically, in what we call the Dark Ages. V'ravta katata ba'olam, there was so much fighting. V'nishtabshu hadrochim, and no one could travel. You could get around in the 2nd century. You couldn't get around in the 7th century. You get your head chopped off by some Viking, or before the Vikings, some Goth who's coming around the corner with a meat cleaver. Okay? But Gayasois, there were bandits everywhere. V'nitma Talmud Torah, and therefore Torah went down. In order for the people to accept, there have to be peace, there has to be some elements of coherence. V'loi nichnasu Yisrael lilmod b'yeshivoisehem. And the Jews just couldn't get it together in these big yeshivas. Alafim v'ravavos, tens of thousands, k'moshe hayu mikodim, like they used to be. Elamiskapsin yechidim, there were little communities scattered. Sridim, remnants. Hashem kare b'chol ir ve'ir b'chol medina. Little bit in Spain, a little bit here, a little bit there. V'oiskim b'Torah u'mevinim b'chiburei chachamim. They were learning whatever they got from the rabbis in Bavel. Kulam v'yodim mehem derech hamishpat heichel. I'm trying to work out what the halacha is. But you never had a situation again where the Jews came together and they could all communicate with each other. And therefore, that's why the Talmud was sealed. It's geopolitical. It's cultural. It's the reality of the Dark Ages. We just couldn't argue with the Talmud because we're now all over the place. That's very interesting. It's not the decline of the generations per se. It's the reality of the physical spread of the Jews in the world. Now, if that's the case, are you going to turn around and say, well, maybe that's changed now? Now, number one, all the Jews in the world are basically in 2 places. They're in Israel and they're in America. And there's like a small scattering. Okay, France is still a significant Jewish population, but it's basically Israel and America. And not only that, it doesn't matter where anyone in the world is. I have a piece of black plastic that can speak to every other person in the entire world who has another piece of black plastic in their hand. So what way are we scattered? Anyone can check anything with anyone everywhere. We're all on mass WhatsApp groups and email groups. Are you going to turn around and say, well, according to the Rambam, we should be making changes in halacha now. We shouldn't be just accepting the way it was because it's a new reality. According to Rav Shiragon, is it like you're out of your mind? You think you're greater than the rabbis of previous generations? It's a ridiculous suggestion. According to the Rambam, I don't know. It's not about level. It's about communication. And we now have that communication. And I think that this actual argument is one of the things which is used by some people more on the fringe of the orthodox halachic discussion, who are arguing, people maybe like Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz and maybe like Rabbi Cardozo, who are making arguments such that now we live in the reality that we live in. There can be some changes that we couldn't do before, we can do now. I don't think that's a mainstream view, but it's coming from here. The other suggestion which is made, and really, that everything comes to a stop if you make this suggestion, is that no, it's not about the geopolitical reality or even about the decline of generations. We have a tradition that Jewish history works in 2,000-year slots. I didn't bring you the original Gemara, but it's the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, I believe, that says that the first 2,000 years are chaos. And the second 2,000 years are Torah. And the third set of 2,000 years are the days where Mashiach could come. But at the end of Torah ended, as it were, download of Torah in the year 4,000. So let's plug that into reality. Look here in Rav Zachariah Fendel, who I don't think he's alive anymore, but he wrote a lot. Rabbi Fendel from Sderot, I think, is a relation of his. Somehow. He says as follows, number 16. It is of interest to note that the compilation of the Mishnah, which represented a major turning point in the process of Torah transmission, took place in 3948. This is also precisely 2,000 years after the birth of Abraham in 1948, Jewish years. It's easier to remember, right? 52 years after this date was the end of the fourth millennium, which the sages referred to as the culmination of the 2 millennia of Torah, which began when Avram Avinu began to disseminate Torah at the age of 52 in the year 2000. So the year 2000 to the year 4000 were the years of Torah, because it goes from Avraham to the end of the Mishnah. Number 17. Actually, the 2 millennia of Torah came to a close shortly before the death of Rebbe's greatest Talmud, Rav, in 4007. Meaning it doesn't quite work because the Mishnah was put together a little bit before the end of 4000. But he says, look at Rav. Rav is the last remaining remnant of the Tanaim. While Rav was one of the earliest Amoraim, he was the last Gadol who also had Tanaitic status, Rav, Tana, Upalig. Every now and then we pull out like a trump card. When Rav argues with someone, we say, no, Rav, how can he argue? Rav's like a Tana. Rav is the last person in history that you could call one of the Tanaim. And when did he die? The year 4000. So he wants to say that it's not about geopolitical realities or about the decline of the generations. It's a simple mathematical number. After the year 4000, there is no new Torah. And the year 4000 is the end of the Mishnah. And we saw in Rashi, the Gemara doesn't really add much. The Gemara just explains. The Gemara just elucidates and analyzes. It doesn't add new Torah. So there's nothing to talk about now. Of course we can't add new Torah. When the Sanhedrin comes, okay, Mashiach, Sanhedrin, all bets are off. Yes, Mrs. Roth.
Though was 2448 when the Torah was actually given.
Good.
to Har Sinai.
Good. So you're saying it doesn't really work. Why are you starting from Avraham? That's like pre-Torah. I hear. That's the reason why this maybe is it's a challenge to this idea. Since when did we start the count of Torah from Avram Avinu? It's not Torah as we know it. It's like life. It's life, but not as we know it. It's Torah, but not as we know it. Okay, fine. Let me leave you with one very interesting, two interesting things. First of all, I'm going to leave you to read page 5 on your own. This is an extract from a long essay from Rav Meir Tribitz. Rav Meir Tribitz, Shlita, is a Rav in Har Nof. If you ever get a chance to meet him, learn from him, read his writings, he is one of the most phenomenal thinkers of the 21st century, without any question. I had the great source to learn under him for quite some time when we lived in Har Nof. He writes in a number of places, but he's engaging here the view of Professor David Weiss-Halivni. Now, I haven't mentioned him yet, but if anybody here has studied any academic Talmud, they'll say that Professor David Weiss-Halivni, who was for many years in Columbia, different places, he says, no, he doesn't think Rav Ashi and Ravina were the people who put all of the arguments together. He thinks that Sof Hora'ah means the end of like Psak. But all of the back and forth, the Shackle of Ataria, that comes in the Gemara says Weissel Livni came later. It came in the next 200 years, in the 500s and the 600s and maybe the 700s. And he even gives a name to those people, the Stamayim. He calls them the Stamayim. They put the Stam Gemara in place. And therefore he wants to say Rav Ashi and Ravina is not the end, but it's the beginning of the end. It's the beginning, and there are sources for this as well. The idea that, looking at number 19, says Rav Shri going here, Ubasahachi, after Ravina Rav Ashi, Afagav the Vadai Hora Lohavat, there wasn't like clear, absolute ruling. Havu Savurai, they were the Savuraim, de Mefarshe Perushi, and they wrote commentaries. De Makarve Lahora, they weren't Hora, but they were close to Hora. And Rabbi Tribitz wants to argue, well, that's really what Halivni is saying. All of the back and forth in the Gemara was put together by that last 3, 4, 5 generations who finished off the Talmud. Actually, I'm not sure a great deal turns on it. You know, if you turn around and say the Gemara was finished in the 5th century by Rav Ashi and Ravina, or if you turn around and say the Gemara was finished in the 8th century by the Savuraim or whatever, I mean, nothing really turns on that. It's no one's going to be an apikoros arguing one way or the other. But it is interesting, and I've brought you Rav Tribitz's proofs, and you can read the whole essay, that he basically agrees that this last couple of hundred years, the 7th and 8th century, maybe slightly into the 9th, was the effective end of the Gemara. One thing is for sure, nobody writes a commentary on the Gemara until around the 10th century, which is very interesting. Nobody actually has down the margins of the sites. And I brought you on page number 6, something which this is your homework for next week, okay? That I've brought you the 500 years between when people do start making commentaries on the Gemara, with people we call the Rishonim, and I've divided up into 5 centuries, and I've divided it up into 3 columns: the Sfaradim in Spain, North Africa, the Ashkenazim in France and Germany, and Provence, which is, of course, a very important southern France community. Now, again, they were the Yemenites, and I'm not getting into all of that now, but these are the 3 main groups of commentators. And what we're going to do starting next week is I'm going to bring you through 5 generations of development in about 10 minutes. Okay, but it'll be fine because you'll have already prepared it beforehand. And the key names that you need to be focused on here are the people that I've put in uppercase letters, which are the people that we'll see going forward. Because next week, what we're going to see is how the Shulchan Aruch changed the landscape of halacha forever in the 1500s, and what he did and why he did it and how that worked. And that'll be, I think, a fascinating analysis. But first, we're going to do this in the first 10 minutes and bring you, cover those 500 years and understand what happened to the Torah by the 15th, 16th century that needed some new developments like that. So I hope that was of interest. Next week, we'll finish this off and then we'll move into other areas, please God.